Good evening. It is a little after midnight on August 25th, 2021. My name is Charity Kraus, and I am the founder of Spacehawk LLC. Spacehawk LLC was formally begun and incorporated in April of 2020, but it is based upon a business plan that was actually an effort at a first response to a number of matters that was formally engaged on October 10th of 2017. I was not aware of any concurrences. I was, however, at the time that I created that business plan, aware of a number of matters that had been a part of an investigation that I had self-initiated, and were also connected to my efforts to obtain certification in non-destructive testing, originally with the hope of being an inspector of industrial pipelines. And then as I began to get more involved with my own investigation and study of the technologies involved, expanded to potentially include other areas, including hopefully sort of full spectrum services associated with, among other things, potential for bioremediation and other kinds of remediation efforts in the event that there was an actual emergency and or a part of a long-term process. It could also be associated with decommissioning facilities or entities that needed to make some sort of transition. The association with decommissioning a facility, I believe, does not necessarily have to be one that is only considered in terms of demolition and is only considered in terms of a cost burden, but I actually believe is part of a potential transition, and that can include a full cycle of responsibility and should be factored into any sort of new industrial development. That we should be in a context where we, by law, and by culture, do not permit for anybody to engage a new endeavor, including an industrial endeavor, unless they have accounted for an expectation of the decommissioning and have budgeted for it. In the course of considerations such as that, things such as inspections become a different kind of value. In fact, I believe they're actually a potentially very highly value-added component of anything specifically involving any sort of industrial development, which can also include public works. And if there is a regular process of value-added contributions, including in terms of human capital that is added through the processes of engaging in the inspection and the qualitative aspects of the inspection process, then fixed assets can be made available to communities in terms of a form of investment that can preclude or prevent against exploitation, including of human capital assets that may compel people to try to compromise on matters related to public safety or considerations of criminal justice. So with that understood, over the course of the last several years, but especially in the last year, I've taken a number of steps with an understanding that part of this also involves substantial legal research as well as legal work that predated and in some manners is separate from my formal endeavors. But I will disclose that I understand, especially under Texas state law, that it is illegal to engage an LLC in a derivative action without formal notice. And by law, unless there is a special exception that is explicitly acknowledged due to an emergency, it cannot commence until 91 days after the formal notice is served. Thus far as I know, while I'm incorporated in the state of Delaware, but mostly active in the state of Texas, no one has ever informed me that my LLC has been engaged in a derivative action. And because I am incorporated now formally as an LLC, my understanding is that as an individual, there is no justification for engaging me in any derivative legal action, even though I am in a process of trying to challenge what I understand to be derivative legal actions that have been visited against my person and may or may not attempt to illegally lien on my LLC. In the course of that, there are a variety of things that could be attended to, could already have been put into place. I have here what is the nascent budget for what would have started as the initial inception of Spacehawk LLC with a formal process of engaging in an upfront capital investment that could then be used to support the individuals that would be the initial members of the LLC to begin the process of applying our expertise in a specific kind of full spectrum inspection services, as well as other matters related to the intent behind the original business. My initial intention was to actually work with people I had trained with. And so when I've conceptualized this, I've kept in mind the kind of people I trained with, what they told me about what their human capital was, what their backgrounds were, what their expertise was, and what their interests were, and how I would have understood that to be compatible with my own. and that what I've done could potentially complement certain things they had expertise in, while the kind of expertise I have could have been complementary to theirs. And upon the actual investment in that, there were other people that could have been considered. And so my initial business model formally budgets for 10 people to start, but has a capacity to expand and include more people as time goes on. Now, since I've incorporated, it's been over a year, but since my intent to incorporate formally a Spacehawk LLC, which would have been following another form of a business plan that I had developed prior to beginning my training, then it would have already been 2 years at least between the formal incorporation and the time frame during which this particular stage would have been initiated and attempted to move forward. So during that time, there would have been some time for us to have acclimated and to have established ourselves, including in a process of proprietary certification with and as Spacehawk LLC, including in connection with getting on-the-job experience relative to specific kinds of standards and specifications. And those certifications and that certification process would have been formalized before changes to the AS&T standards that would have been a basis for consideration of recertification that went into effect last July. I will say formally that I have serious misgivings about the changes that were provided as part of the AS&T standards regarding training for personnel associated with a NDT training facility. And I think some of the things that they did in the changes were structurally less wise than they otherwise should have been, and that there are actually some older standards in the course of some of the changes that have taken place that I think have a certain kind of validity and should have been considered at that time, so that right now we would have that available, as opposed to what has practically resulted from the kind of changes that were implemented last July. So with that said, I will say that insofar as somebody might have contacted me in my capacity and said that there was a need for a first response relative to what my business endeavors had available, relative to the expertise of the people with whom I was involved, and with an understanding of what was being requested. What I have here is, in the last few days, I have researched some of the primary source information regarding the specific vendors or the specific suppliers of the equipment, as well as understanding that I'd already had a plan in place for specific transportation options, and a initial budget that has an amount that is not as specific as it needs to be, because the specific price considerations would have to be put into accordance with an understanding of the specifications of the specific job. But in terms of the upfront capital investment that would have been required at the rates of today, I have a budget that would have started off as being, would have necessitated a need for a little over $7 million as the initial startup in order to get what would be needed, with an understanding that that amount would have provided the foundation for the first year of getting what we needed and to start actually getting into the field to start doing what needed to be done, including assessments in connection with communities and or entities we would be working with directly. And that is based on a specific kind of understanding of what I would understand to be an appropriate valuation and, shall we say, consideration of the capital value of the people that would be doing this. So when you would call and you would have a need for this, this would be the kind of value you would be calling on as an investment into your endeavors. And I think that's very important, how we value ourselves and what we're willing to invest in making sure that what we're doing is sound and safe is going to be what we invest in what we do. And so when you're doing an inspection, when you have an understanding of a practical, literal foundation of what your value is, then that is how you're looking at what you're analyzing. And that's what you're going to be investing. And that's part of what I'm talking about when I say I understand it to be a potential value-added contribution to the entity or the community. And these are what I would consider to be practical standards that would actually provide people not only with what they would need in terms of being able to do their job and to negotiate whatever they would consider to be a rate or benefit associated with their actual relationship, which could potentially and hopefully would involve being an equity owner, but would also be, what they would have to work with to develop their own specific kind of expertise or their own specific kind of capacity to perform their duties and to perform and analyze what their options were and what they wanted to be doing actually in the field, so that then we could provide that and hopefully follow up on that in a long-term process. Now, in order to do something like what was called down, so to speak, there have to be a number of things involved. So there are some things that are outstanding that would need to be reconciled. Among those things is, here I have a budget that is outstanding from what were an anticipated first year's worth of wages that would have been acquired in performance of a part-time job that was working for a Texas institution headquartered here in Texas. While it has been involved in some litigation, including litigation that I am concerned actually involved my LLC or my person in some derivative legal action, they provide something that's very important and very necessary and is actually materially relevant to a full spectrum analysis of what would be included in these kind of inspection services, including an understanding that in order to qualify for that job, one of the things that had to happen was one had to go through a training to get certification in how to handle hazardous materials, as well as how to handle laws related to the Texas Beverage Code. And so these are moments when you are potentially exposed to if something that, if mishandled, could present a danger or a peril, and would be the kind of things that on another level somebody may try to abuse in a derivative process connected to other things that would be necessary to successfully perform an industrial inspection. And so in the course of that, there was a situation that has not been reconciled, and it actually visited an injury to me in the form of at least, as I accounted for, $21,551.64. This was an anticipated wages that would have been used for me personally to receive recertification and the certificates I already have, and also would have allowed me to buy materials, and would also have allowed me to have the time to purchase a bond so that I could bond my certificates. That bond was estimated as being a certain amount that would provide a sort of foundation for bonding the certificates so that they would be secured. And then as they were used moving forward, they would be able to have that backing them as well. Because of what ended up happening, that ended up being an actual literal material tangible amount that I do not have access to. It has been over 6 months now since that injury first resulted, and since I attempted to contact the formal legal representatives of that entity, which thus far has been denied. But it is important to know that that could have been made available by this time, exactly right now. I have all of the information concerning the budget, and how that budget would have applied not only to training and recertification as well as bonding of the certificates, but also could have been used for a specific kind of healthcare modality, which would be a private healthcare modality that I personally agree with and think could be a part of an actual response to not only considerations of benefits and social good, but what is an appropriate valuation and configuration of considerations of healthcare. So that is here. I will say that I also have an inventory here of items that I have purchased with the express intent of understanding that they would be made available not only from my LLC as a investment in my LLC, but also in consideration of what I understood the alleged individual relief for COVID-19 was really about, which was a form of, in a very crass way of saying it, or a very basic way of saying it, allowing for the people of the United States to understand ourselves as an equity contributor or investor in what was happening with the rest of the United States based upon the consolidation of assets associated with the response to COVID-19. Now, there are a variety of ways to understand this legally, but what I understood was I used that money as an investment in my LLC to buy things I would have done with my LLC, up to and including on the level of understanding that as a small business owner, I would also potentially be eligible for public service, including in a formal role as a representative of the people in state government. And so what I was investing in would have been things that could also have been used to secure the state, to secure the people, including through specific state offices. And this is a very interesting thing, because one of my concerns is that part of what's been happening with the COVID relief, especially if we've received some sort of electronic assistance or electronic funds, is that somebody's keeping track of it. Someone's keeping track of our purchases, someone's keeping track of our expenditures, and they are actually creating a budget of sorts, or they are creating options based upon our actual consumption. that was part of what the stimulus was supposed to be, to stimulate the economy. Well, what do you consider to be an investment in the economy, even with the limited means you might have if you were reduced to, or if you only had access to the basic COVID relief? And so in that accord, I ended up compiling a budget based upon investments in my LLC from the purchases specifically from the COVID relief that I claimed on my taxes. And I'm currently in this matter right now involved in a tax dispute because the IRS does not acknowledge COVID-19 as a form of income that is taxable. I am very, very concerned about this on a lot of levels. I'm trying to deal with it the best I can in that regard, but I do understand it was for me income into my LLC. Not only that, I believe it should be considered taxable income. And insofar as it was income that was invested in my LLC, it would have made me eligible for a U.S. savings bond as part of what would have been the return that I could have also invested in securing my LLC. See, at this point now, the options available to me when it comes to bonds or some sort of security for my work or my business endeavors is different than it would have been if I had been able to invest in a U.S. savings bond as part of my relationship to understanding what COVID-19 and the efforts related to COVID-19 are about. Especially if we're talking about something having to do with inspections associated with infrastructure or industrial development, then the idea of understanding that I had income as part of a first response that was then invested in an LLC that would be providing these services for the country and was bonded with a U.S. savings bond from that specific endeavor would have a very different material reality, not only for my LLC and for those with whom I work, but also in a consideration of its relationship as being circulated to and through the federal government. In addition to that, there were also investment opportunities because of a refusal or a delay in responding to what were already pre-existing claims that were part of my investigations, were not able to be delivered on. But insofar as I was keeping track of the accounting, and the timelines came and were available, there are here at least two major investments that are reflected not only in public notices provided, but also in work content I did at the time, that by now could have resulted in a substantial potential investment in a major media capital company or capital venture that ended up becoming a majority holder in the Tribune Publishing Company, which I contend has a lot of potential social value that has not been appropriately utilized thus far. But has not been made available because of the non-response to pre-existing efforts and or acknowledgement of what would have been available at the time. And then another matter that is connected to a long-term investigation, including in connection with a formal request I made to Congress in early 2016 regarding the relationship of a particular banking entity and its connection with other financial institutions. I tracked a specific process for over a year, starting in April of last year, having a very significant intercession with and through foreign markets in which it was involved in June of last year that I have reported on in my other videos and several matters. And then I followed up with what I was doing a year later in terms of keeping track of or accounting for that process of tracking. So I have the initial understanding of what I was tracking at the time I first became aware of it, what ended up coming up through the year, and including what I saw at the time it was happening, and I followed up with what could be considered a sort of a 1 year transaction record in that process of tracking. This could potentially be and would actually legitimately be something that would yield an actual recovery. And so, for instance, if you're doing some kind of inspection or some kind of audit as an independent auditor and it yields an actual response, including a potential recovery, then there are considerations around that. Beginning in 2016, the understanding was by law, if you were requesting assistance with fraud involving certain federal agencies and you filed a claim, if the state did not support you and there was a recovery, you were entitled to up to 20% of that recovery. To this time, I've had absolutely no formal contact with or in connection with the state or the federal government, numerous states or the federal government, and yet I've tracked how there have been a number of recoveries directly attributable to my investigative efforts, including ones that still have open report numbers. By now, there could have been substantial recoveries that could have been invested either through my LLC or in some other kind of endeavor, including potentially in some form of bond or trust associated with other people that were subjected to some sort of injury as a result of what justified the inception of those investigative efforts to begin with. One of those would include this specific endeavor, but on the other hand, in the last 10 days, I've taken what could otherwise be efforts to attempt to follow through on prosecution for criminal charges because I believe there is enough evidence available now that brings up the concept of monetary restitution in a different manner. And the priority would be toward actually supporting legal efforts, including evidence gathering and whatever would be the sureties on any of the possibilities, including, if necessary, supporting people with paying their legal fees in the event that they needed legal protection or they needed some sort of legal assistance, and also following through on this. I will say that I consider it to be a very important process when it comes to actual industrial inspection to make sure that moments that are crime are prosecuted as crime. Because there's a very specific relationship that prosecuting crime as crime has to legitimate legal insurance, as opposed to using insurance networks as a way to recirculate money that has not been divested from its actual illicit processes and instead is used as a kind of accrual of liability that is leveraged, including in a false form of competition that might retaliate against an opponent unnecessarily and illegally, and in a way that has other kinds of social cost as it falls out on people. This is very important, especially if we're talking about industrial development or anything having to do with an intersection with public works or things that impact health and human safety. In addition to that, I have what I understand to be a budget of what are earnings I have not been paid for yet. And this is just in the last year. I've calculated at what would have been my rate of understanding work productivity, and also with an understanding that I would be connected to something more than just myself. I'm not a sole proprietor in these kinds of calculations. But since May of 2020, my understanding is that by the accounting I've been working with, I have acquired $90,153,000 and would have provided the means by which to pay $33,898,500 in tax. Now, the specific accounting system I'm working with right now is one that is based upon not only a rate in terms of the manner in which I understand the actual product this is based on is valuated, but also with an understanding that in this sort of situation I am not exclusively operating in my own personal private interest. That this particular kind of income would be the kind of income I would be performing in, for instance, a formal state role, with an understanding that in a specific kind of role, there may be an expectation of producing something that had enough of a value that it could be a contribution to the state or to the particular department or agency within the state I was primarily associated. So the work actually has a value. The time you spend connected to and committed to that endeavor has a value. And so producing at that level with that value has a certain kind of revenue stream, which would include over $90 million in terms of what would be considered revenue for investment, and then 33 or almost $34 million that would have been available as tax that could have been a part of some sort of either general fund or specific allocation, including in a manner that could be separated out of other operational budgets, so that it could be made available for programs that would necessarily need a different kind of security and a different kind of oversight than the things that I would be focused on, especially if we're talking about something having to do with criminal justice, and or we have something having to do with processes connected to industrial inspection and following up on all that goes into processes associated with what necessitates a need for an industrial inspection. If this were to be applied, there would be no excuse for saying we don't have money in the budget for maintenance. There would be no excuse for saying we don't have money in the budget for inspections or paying inspectors at a high rate, including a rate that could assure against any sort of attempt to extort or coerce them into compromising on standards. As evidence that this is actually justified, I will say, I have several things that were on my desktop that were things that I did, reflections, reviews of cases, reviews of opinions, Some of those are reflected in notes I have right here. These notes right here are actually written notes connected to voice files that were done during a period of time when I was reviewing opinions that were provided by past attorneys general of Texas. This is part of what I understand would be an official role, would be to evaluate past opinions, to see about the context, to identify not only what could potentially be perilous, but also could be something that needed to be followed up on, including in some form of benchmarking strategy or in some sort of accountability structure. This is evidence on one hand. But on the other hand, this is also evidence. And what this is notes, written notes. I've had 3 times now a specific argument I made on a specific constitutional issue stolen from me. We're talking about the aggregate of more than 2 hours of audio files, perhaps 3, over 3 separate times. And this specific argument has been already used in at least 2 cases that have gone before the Supreme Court of the United States or have been announced as pending before the Supreme Court of the United States in just the last year. This lets me know that whoever feels that they're entitled to steal my actual work products is actually using them for something that they understand is at that level. And I contend I've absolutely actually justified saying that this is the kind of value and this is the kind of investment that would have been made specifically here in the state of Texas, including in availability for other endeavors that the state of Texas needs as a priority in just the last year. And insofar as to this time, there has been a refusal to return those audio files. And there's also been a refusal to cease and desist the cases associated with the theft of those audio files. I contend I absolutely have done that work. I've absolutely done that work. I've done that work at that level. I've done that work at that quality. I've done that work at that understanding of the potential investment that would have been made into the state just on that level with my own resources. And in the course of that, I am in a process of trying to contest a $1,200 dispute with the IRS, actually $1,233. My tax return, it's in dispute. They did not consider it to be revenue to me so that I could get a bond. But in the course of that, what we also understand is that there is more than $90 million worth of investment in the state of Texas just for me alone. That is also not reflected. And there's more than $34 million of tax income. That is also not reflected. It's just one woman who's had no one to talk to, who's been consistent in following up on other people's refusals to get back to me. We could have absolutely 100% been ready tonight. We could have been ready tonight. In 48 hours, we'd be ready to deploy. If you needed us to do some sort of survey based upon a map, including one that would have priorities, and then we would have to be in a situation where we would make a priority list for ourselves upon where we would go and give you a schedule. How long do you need? 3 months? 6 months? A year? 18 months? It's right here.